Our words from Jesus today come from his Sermon on the Mount, his first foray into preaching in the book of Matthew, one that delves into all aspects of life and faith and how the two are intertwined in our shared human experience. It's all on the table for Jesus. Jesus' words today also make an assumption. They assume that people are already engaging in these spiritual disciplines. And this assumption may have been accurate during Jesus' life, but it is not an assumption we can make today. So let's back up a little. What is a spiritual discipline? A spiritual discipline is an individual or personal practice that is meant to help you live in right relationship with God. A spiritual discipline may be the stripping away of something that separates you from God, or it may be the adding of something that brings you closer to God. This is why the questions, what are you giving up for Lent? And what are you doing for Lent? Are commonly heard this time of year. These are questions I have asked others and questions that people have asked me. And I imagine many of you have asked or been asked these questions as well. These questions are asked because we cannot assume that we are engaging in spiritual disciplines. Instead, the season of Lent is an invitation to engage in spiritual discipline, a discipline or a practice of your choosing, as a way of bringing you closer to God. And Jesus highlights 3 spiritual disciplines that were common during his time: the giving of alms, prayer, and fasting. Giving of alms or charitable giving. We live today in a society that is constantly telling us that what we have is not enough, that we need more in order to be successful or accepted. The giving of alms is an invitation to accept that we have enough and to give to those who don't have enough from what we do have, sharing in our God-given gifts for the sake of our neighbors. And there is mutuality in this giving. What you may have in excess may be in short supply for someone else, and that same someone else may have an excess of something that may be in short supply for you. And when everyone gives out of their own abundance, we mutually support and connect to one another. Prayer. If a spiritual discipline is something that helps us live in right relationship with God, a spiritual discipline of prayer is one where prayer is focused on that relationship. You may have noticed in the gospel reading that we skipped over 10 verses. And these 10 verses that we skipped over are Jesus giving us a specific example of how to pray. An example that each one of us can do, and many of us probably already do. It is in these verses that Jesus gives us the words that we have come to call the Lord's Prayer. A prayer that focuses on our relationship with God, who God is, what is within our control, and what is in God's control. A simple yet all-encompassing prayer. And fasting. This is perhaps the one most people commonly allude to when asking, "What are you giving up for Lent?" It's something that we often associate with food, so it can be a fasting from a type of food or drink, but it does not have to be, does it? For fasting is a form of abstaining from something, from anything. So, what is a regular part of your life that draws you away from your relationship with God? The spiritual discipline of fasting is one that takes intention. It is a practice that helps our faith sustain amidst adversity and challenge. This Lent, we are invited into spiritual disciplines. These 3 that Jesus mentions, and more. We're invited into a spiritual discipline that comes from our own discernment, for only we as individuals know what we need to do to reorient ourselves towards God. And as we discern and begin practicing our spiritual discipline this Lent, we are called to remember Jesus' words for today. Jesus' words for us today are less about what our spiritual discipline is and more about how we engage our spiritual discipline. Jesus is focused on a person's motivation behind the spiritual discipline. His focus calls out our brokenness as humans and redirects us and our hearts towards God. As humans, we have a propensity to participate and engage in things for accolades, for how successful they help make us, or for showing to others how we have ourselves all put together. And we live in a world that supports doing these things. Award shows, trophies, and prizes abound across ages, industries, and activities. We seek recognition for what we do. The ever-elusive concept of success has people going into debt to purchase status symbols of wealth, a society's measure of our value. Social media has become a highlight reel showing only the quote-unquote good parts of life, creating a false narrative that we've got it figured out and we have ourselves put together, that we don't struggle. And yet we know we do struggle. And none of these are inherently wrong. They are components of our humanity. And yet, Jesus is inviting us to resist these forces of the world when we engage in a spiritual discipline. Jesus is inviting us to shift our priorities away from earthly ones towards godly ones. Jesus is inviting us to do things for God and for God alone. Jesus is reminding us that God is God and we are not. So this Lent, may the actions and inactions, the taking up and the putting down, the adding and subtracting through our spiritual disciplines bring us closer to God and closer to God's world and to one another. May we feel more connected to one another through our centering of God in our lives. May this Lenten journey be one of focus, clarity, and hope in the God who created us from dust of the earth and the God who calls us good. Amen.